Thank you for clicking in this video. Are you ready to confront the unknown? In the eerie depths of an abandoned subway, or the unsettling solitude of a seemingly normal apartment, two chilling stories await. Secrets lie buried in shadows and whispers, and what you think you know about safety and reality will be tested. Can our protagonists escape the horrors that lurk in the dark? Stick around to unravel the mysteries and face the fear that hides in plain sight.
I've always been drawn to the forgotten places, the cracks in the urban landscape where the past refuses to die. It was this obsession that led me to the 2nd Avenue subway project in New York City. The project had been plagued by delays, budget overruns, and, more intriguing to me, rumors. Whispers of workers disappearing, strange sounds emanating from the depths, and tunnels that weren't on any map. These stories had been circulating for decades, but no one seemed to take them seriously, no one except me and a small group of urban explorers I'd become close to. We called ourselves the Ghosts of Gotham, a name that might sound pretentious, but it fit our interests. We weren't just thrill seekers, we were historians, documentarians of the city's forgotten underbelly. Abandoned buildings, hidden passageways, and old tunnels were our playgrounds, and the 2nd Avenue subway was our next big adventure. The plan was simple: explore the sections of the tunnel that had been sealed off during construction, the ones the city had forgotten or deliberately hidden. We'd done our homework, studying old blueprints, reading up on the history of the project, and interviewing retired workers who had been on the job back in the 1970s when construction first started. Most of them were tight-lipped, but a few let slip that there were indeed parts of the tunnel that had been lost. Whether that meant collapsed, sealed off, or simply abandoned, they wouldn't say. I was the one who found the key piece of information, buried in a dusty archive in the bowels of the New York Public Library. It was a map, drawn by hand, dated 1927. It showed a tunnel branching off from the main line, marked only with a question mark. There were no other details, no notes, nothing. Just that cryptic symbol. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, the tunnel that the workers had supposedly found all those years ago, the one that led to God knows where. We met on a chilly autumn night, the kind where the wind cuts through your jacket and the city feels alive with secrets. There were 5 of us: me, James, our de facto leader with a love for all things ancient and obscure; Lydia, our tech expert who could rig a camera to anything and had a knack for picking locks; Marcus, the muscle of the group, though his brawn was matched by a surprising depth of knowledge about urban legends; and Claire, who was as much a skeptic as she was an adrenaline junkie. We entered through a service door we'd pried open on 96th Street. The air inside the tunnel was heavy, thick with the smell of earth and rusting metal. The light from our headlamps cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but endless tracks and the occasional rat darting across the ground. We moved quietly, our footsteps echoing eerily off the walls. It was as if the tunnel itself was holding its breath, waiting. After about a mile, we found it, a sealed-off section of the tunnel, marked by a rusty, padlocked gate. This was where the blueprints ended, but according to the old map I'd found, there was more beyond this point. James pulled out a crowbar, and with a few grunts and the screech of metal on metal, the gate swung open. What we found on the other side was unexpected. The tunnel wasn't like the one we'd been walking through. The walls were rougher, older, as if they'd been carved out of the earth by hand rather than by machines. And the tracks, they weren't the steel rails of the subway, but wooden beams, rotting and decayed. This tunnel wasn't on any map, not even the old ones. The air was colder here, and there was a smell, faint but distinct, something sweet and rotten. I looked back at the others. Even Lydia, who was usually unflappable, looked unnerved. But we'd come this far, and there was no way we were turning back now. We pressed on, deeper into the tunnel, our nerves stretched tight. The walls seemed to close in around us, and the darkness grew thicker, almost tangible. And then we heard it, a low, almost imperceptible whisper, like the wind through a narrow crack. We stopped, listening, but the sound was gone. Just our imaginations, I told myself. But something didn't feel right. We rounded a corner, and that's when we saw it, a doorway, half buried in the wall, with strange symbols carved into the stone around it. The door itself was old, made of heavy wood and iron, and it looked like it hadn't been opened in decades, maybe longer. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out to touch it, the wood cold and unyielding under my fingers. This was it. The point of no return. The door groaned as it opened, the sound reverberating through the tunnel like a death rattle. We stood there for a moment, hesitating, as if an invisible force was holding us back. But the thrill of discovery, the need to know what lay beyond, pushed us forward. The space beyond the door was different, colder, darker, as if the very air had been sucked out. Our headlamps flickered slightly, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. The tunnel here was narrower, and the walls were lined with strange markings, symbols that none of us could identify. They looked ancient, almost primordial, like something out of a forgotten era. "This isn't on any map," James whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Maybe it was never meant to be found," Claire murmured, her usual bravado replaced by a rare note of unease. We moved cautiously, the floor beneath us shifting with each step. The smell that had been faint before was now stronger, more pungent, a sickly sweet odor that turned my stomach. It was the smell of decay, of something long dead. Lydia scanned the walls with her camera, capturing the strange symbols and the oppressive atmosphere. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the earth, far beneath the city that bustled above us, unaware of the horrors hidden below. After what felt like hours, the tunnel opened up into a large chamber, the ceiling lost in darkness. The walls here were different, smoother, as if they had been deliberately carved. In the center of the chamber was something that made my blood run cold, a massive stone altar, stained dark with age, and something else, something that glistened faintly in the dim light. "What the hell is this?" Marcus muttered, his voice thick with dread. None of us had an answer. We approached the altar cautiously, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. As we drew closer, I noticed something carved into the stone, a series of symbols similar to the ones we'd seen earlier, but more intricate, more malevolent. They seemed to pulse with a dark energy, almost as if they were alive. Lydia's camera beeped, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. "There's something wrong with the equipment," she said, frowning at the screen. "It's picking up some kind of interference, but there's nothing down here that should be causing it." "Maybe we should head back," Claire suggested, her voice trembling slightly. "We've seen enough." But James shook his head. "We've come this far. We need to find out what's going on here." He stepped closer to the altar, his flashlight sweeping over the surface. That's when we saw it, a narrow passage leading downwards, hidden behind the altar, almost as if it had been deliberately concealed. The air coming from the passage was colder, thicker, and the smell, it was almost unbearable now. "Are we really going down there?" Lydia asked, her voice barely concealing her fear. "We have to," James replied, though I could tell even he was beginning to doubt the wisdom of this expedition. One by one, we descended into the passage, the walls pressing in on us, the darkness growing deeper with each step. The only sound was our breathing, ragged and tense, and the distant drip of water echoing through the tunnel. The passage twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the earth, into a place that felt ancient, forgotten, and utterly malevolent. It was then that I began to notice the changes in the air around us. It felt wrong. Thick, almost oppressive, like it was alive, pressing in on us from all sides. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they were breathing, and the shadows moved in ways that defied logic, curling and twisting in the corners of my vision. And then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deep within the passage. We froze, the sound cutting through the darkness like a knife. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a sound that was more animal than human, and yet, there was something familiar about it, something that sent a chill down my spine. What the hell was that? Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Keep moving, James ordered, though his voice was shaking. We need to see what's down there. But as we continued deeper into the passage, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was following us, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, as we rounded another corner, we saw it, an opening in the wall, a massive, gaping maw of darkness that seemed to swallow the light from our headlamps. The growl came again, louder this time, echoing through the passage. Whatever was down there, it wasn't human. For the first time since we'd started this journey, I felt true fear, a cold, creeping dread that settled deep in my bones. I wanted to turn back, to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't. We couldn't. We were too far in, and whatever was waiting for us down there, we had to face it. We had no choice but to descend into the darkness, into the unknown, into the very heart of the myth that had haunted the 2nd Avenue subway for decades. The descent into the darkness felt like it lasted an eternity. Each step down the uneven stone steps echoed through the tunnel, our collective breath held in suspense. The growl we'd heard before had faded, but its memory lingered, keeping us on edge. The air was thick with an almost tangible tension, as if the very walls of the tunnel were closing in on us. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into another chamber. This one was smaller, the ceiling low and oppressive. The only light came from our headlamps, which flickered erratically as we stepped inside, their beams cutting through the thick, almost suffocating darkness. The walls of this chamber were different, slick with moisture. They glistened in the faint light, covered in a thin layer of something that looked disturbingly like slime. The smell was overpowering now, a nauseating mix of rot and something metallic, like blood. My stomach churned, and I had to fight back the urge to gag. In the center of the chamber stood something that sent a shiver down my spine, a large, black obelisk, covered in the same strange symbols we'd seen before, but these were different. They were deeper, more defined, almost as if they'd been carved by something with claws rather than hands. The obelisk pulsed with a faint, eerie glow, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. "What the hell is that?" Lydia whispered, her voice trembling. None of us had an answer. We approached the obelisk cautiously, every instinct screaming at us to turn back. But we were too deep now, too close to whatever truth lay hidden in these tunnels. As we neared the obelisk, the temperature dropped sharply, our breath visible in the frigid air. James reached out to touch the obelisk, his hand trembling slightly. The moment his fingers made contact, the ground beneath us shook violently, knocking us off our feet. The obelisk began to glow brighter, the symbols pulsing with a sickly green light. The walls of the chamber groaned, as if something massive was stirring within them. And then we heard it again, the growl, louder this time, closer. It echoed through the chamber, a sound so deep and primal that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the tunnel. We scrambled to our feet, panic setting in as the walls around us seemed to close in, the darkness growing thicker, almost alive. "We need to get out of here," Claire shouted, her voice rising in fear. But before we could move, the shadows around us began to shift and twist, forming shapes, humanoid figures, tall and impossibly thin, their eyes glowing with the same sickly light as the obelisk. They moved with unnatural speed, circling us, their presence overwhelming, suffocating. "What are they?" Marcus gasped, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here now," I yelled, my voice trembling with fear. We turned and bolted for the passageway we'd come from, the shadows pursuing us with relentless speed. The chamber behind us shook violently, the walls cracking as the figures moved closer, their growls filling the air. We could feel the cold, clammy touch of their presence at our backs, as if they were reaching out to drag us back into the darkness. As we reached the stairs, the passageway collapsed behind us with a deafening roar, sealing off the chamber and the horrors within. We didn't stop to look back. Our only focus was on getting out, on escaping the nightmare we'd stumbled into. We ran up the stairs, the ground beneath us trembling with each step. The tunnel above was a blur as we sprinted towards the exit, the shadows still chasing us, their growls echoing through the darkness. My lungs burned with the effort, my heart pounding in my chest as adrenaline surged through my veins. We reached the gate we'd pried open earlier, and without a second thought, we threw ourselves through it, slamming it shut behind us. The shadows stopped just beyond the gate, their glowing eyes watching us with a hunger that sent a chill down my spine. But they didn't follow. For reasons I couldn't comprehend, they remained trapped behind the gate, their growls fading into the darkness. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The tunnel was silent now, the oppressive presence of the shadows gone, replaced by the familiar hum of the city above. But the memory of what we'd seen, what we'd barely escaped, lingered in the air. "We're alive," Marcus said, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Yeah," I replied, still trying to catch my breath. "But we need to get out of here, now." We didn't waste any time. We gathered our gear and hurried back through the tunnel, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The tension in the air had lifted, but the fear lingered, a dark cloud that hung over us as we made our way back to the surface. As we climbed out of the service door and back into the cool night air, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We were out, we were safe, but I knew that we had only just begun to understand the true horror of what lay beneath the streets of New York. As we stood there, catching our breath and trying to process what had just happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped completely. There was something about those shadows, something ancient and malevolent, that felt unfinished, like a curse that had been temporarily lifted but not broken. And then I realized this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The night air was cold, a stark contrast to the stifling, oppressive atmosphere of the tunnels below. We stood in silence, our breaths visible in the pale glow of the streetlights. The city was alive around us, oblivious to the terror that lurked just beneath its surface. The realization that we had come so close to something unspeakable hung heavy over us. But as I looked at my friends, I knew that the nightmare wasn't over yet. "We can't leave it like this," Claire finally said, breaking the silence. "There's something down there, something that doesn't belong." She was right. As much as every part of me wanted to run far away and never look back, I knew we couldn't leave without understanding what we had encountered. If those shadows were real, if that obelisk had somehow summoned them, then we had to know why. And more importantly, we had to make sure they couldn't reach the surface. "Do we have a choice?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. The fear in his eyes mirrored my own, but there was something else there too, determination. We were in too deep now to just walk away. "We go back," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But this time, we come prepared." We spent the next few hours gathering supplies. Flashlights, ropes, a few makeshift weapons, anything that could give us an edge against the unknown. James suggested we contact someone, authorities, maybe, but we quickly dismissed the idea. Who would believe us? No, this was something we had to deal with ourselves. By the time we were ready, dawn was just beginning to break. The soft light of morning seemed almost reassuring, but it did little to ease the tension that had settled over us. As we made our way back to the service entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was waiting for us. The tunnel was just as we had left it, silent and foreboding. But this time, there was no turning back. We descended the stairs again, the memory of the shadows fresh in our minds. Every sound, every flicker of movement in the darkness set my nerves on edge. But we pressed on, driven by a need to confront whatever horror lay ahead. When we reached the collapsed passageway, we hesitated. The rubble had shifted slightly, as if something had tried to push through from the other side. The air was thick with the same nauseating stench as before, and I could feel the cold tendrils of fear creeping up my spine. "We're close," Lydia whispered, her voice trembling. Using our tools, we began to clear the debris, our hands shaking with the effort. The sound of the stones scraping against each other echoed ominously through the tunnel. It took longer than we expected, but eventually we cleared a path just wide enough for us to squeeze through. The chamber beyond was darker than before, the obelisk's glow barely visible. The air was freezing, our breath forming misty clouds in front of us. But something was different. The shadows were gone, or at least they weren't visible. The silence was deafening, pressing in on us from all sides. "What now?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. We had come back to confront the darkness, but it was clear that whatever had been here before was no longer contained. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Had we unleashed something by disturbing this place? Suddenly, the ground beneath us shook violently, throwing us off balance. The walls of the chamber groaned, cracks spreading across the stone as if the very earth was trying to swallow us whole. The obelisk pulsed with a sickly green light, brighter than before, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, followed by a voice, deep and resonant, echoing through the chamber. It spoke in a language none of us recognized, the words filled with a malevolent power that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Who are you?" I shouted into the darkness, my voice trembling. The voice didn't answer, but the growling grew louder, more intense. It was then that I realized the truth. The obelisk wasn't just a relic, it was a doorway, a conduit to something far older and more dangerous than we could have imagined. And we had opened it. "We need to close it," Lydia shouted over the noise, her eyes wide with fear. "How?" I yelled back, panic rising in my chest. Before anyone could answer, the ground gave way beneath us, sending us tumbling into the darkness below. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. The world spun, and for a moment, I couldn't move. But then I heard the others, their groans of pain and fear, and I forced myself to get up. We had fallen into another chamber, this one even larger than the last. The walls were covered in the same symbols, glowing faintly in the dark. But the obelisk was gone, replaced by a gaping hole in the center of the room, from which the growling emanated. The air was thick with malevolence, a dark energy that made it hard to breathe. "We have to close it," I repeated, more to myself than to the others. "But how?" We had no idea what we were dealing with, no idea how to stop it. As I stood there, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, I realized something. The obelisk had responded to us, to our presence. It had reacted when we touched it, when we cleared the passage. Maybe, just maybe, we could reverse whatever we had done. Everyone, grab onto each other. I shouted, a plan forming in my mind. The others hesitated for a moment, but then they moved, huddling together near the edge of the pit. I grabbed James' hand, feeling the cold sweat on his palm, and closed my eyes. Concentrating, I focused on the symbols, on the strange energy that filled the air. Focus on the light, I said, my voice trembling. Focus on sealing it, on closing the door. I had no idea if it would work, but it was the only chance we had. As we stood there, hands clasped tightly together, I could feel the energy shifting, pulling us toward the pit. The growling grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was on the other side could sense what we were doing. And then, slowly, the pit began to close. The darkness receded, the growling fading into a distant rumble. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, pulsing with a rhythmic energy that matched the beating of my heart. The cold began to lift, replaced by a warmth that spread through my body, soothing the fear that had gripped me. As the last of the darkness was swallowed by the light, the chamber fell silent. The pit was gone, replaced by solid stone, and the air was still, the oppressive energy dissipated. We stood there, stunned and exhausted, trying to comprehend what had just happened. "We did it," Lydia whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "We actually did it." But even as relief washed over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. We had closed the door, but I knew, deep down, that we hadn't sealed it completely. Whatever was on the other side was still there, waiting, and it would find another way to reach us. For now, though, we were safe. And that was enough. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Before it decides to open again." We didn't argue. We made our way back to the surface, the tunnels eerily quiet as we retraced our steps. The city above was just beginning to wake, the first rays of sunlight breaking over the horizon. As we emerged from the service entrance, the warm light of morning felt like a balm, washing away the darkness that had clung to us. But as I looked back at the tunnel, at the dark entrance that led to the nightmare below, I knew that I would never forget what we had seen. The myth that had haunted the 2nd Avenue subway was more than just a legend, it was a warning. And we had come dangerously close to unleashing something far worse. As we emerged into the fresh morning air, the oppressive weight of the tunnels began to lift from our shoulders. The sun had fully risen now, casting the streets of New York in a warm, golden light. The city was waking up, oblivious to the horrors lurking beneath its streets. But as we stood there, breathing in the clean air, I knew that our ordeal wasn't over yet. We had managed to close the pit, but the uneasy feeling in my gut told me that something was still wrong. The door was closed, yes, but not locked. The entity, whatever it was, would find another way to reach us. We couldn't leave things as they were. We needed to make sure that the nightmare we had encountered remained buried for good. "We can't just walk away," I said, breaking the silence. The others looked at me, their faces pale and drawn. They were exhausted, like I was, but there was no denying the truth in my words. Marcus nodded slowly. "We need to seal it, permanently." "But how?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "We barely managed to survive down there. How are we supposed to seal something we don't even understand?" "We don't need to understand it," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "We just need to make sure it stays buried." Lydia, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "There are ways, ancient ways to seal things. I've read about them. We just need to find the right place, the right words." Her words gave me a glimmer of hope. Lydia had always been the skeptic, the one who dismissed superstitions and old wives' tales. But after what we had seen, it was clear that this was no ordinary situation. If there was even a chance that we could seal the entity for good, we had to take it. We spent the rest of the morning researching, scouring old books and online forums for anything that might help. It felt strange, searching for answers in dusty tomes and obscure websites in the heart of one of the world's most modern cities. But as the day wore on, we began to piece together a plan. There were ancient rituals, methods of binding malevolent forces that had been used for centuries. Most of them were rooted in forgotten religions and esoteric practices, the kind of things that most people dismissed as nonsense. But after what we had experienced, we were willing to try anything. We gathered the materials we needed: salt, candles, a few symbols copied from old texts. It felt like we were preparing for something out of a horror movie, but the stakes were all too real. If we failed, the entity could break free again, and there was no telling what kind of havoc it would wreak on the city above. As night fell, we made our way back to the entrance of the tunnels. The city was alive with activity, the hum of traffic and distant voices creating a comforting backdrop to our grim task. But as we descended once more into the darkness, the familiar dread returned, wrapping around us like a shroud. The chamber was just as we had left it, silent and foreboding. The pit was still closed, but the air was thick with the same oppressive energy, as if the entity was still lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to escape. "We need to do this quickly," I said, my voice echoing in the vast space. "No mistakes." We arranged the materials in a circle around the spot where the pit had been, following the instructions as closely as we could. The candles flickered in the still air, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. The symbols, drawn carefully in chalk, seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Lydia began to chant, her voice low and steady. The words were in a language none of us understood, but they resonated with a strange power, filling the chamber with a sense of anticipation. As she continued, the air grew colder, the oppressive energy intensifying. The ground beneath us trembled slightly, a low rumble that sent a chill down my spine. I could feel the presence of the entity, pressing against the barrier we had created, trying to break through. But Lydia's voice didn't falter, and neither did we. We held our ground, focusing all our energy on the ritual. As the chant reached its climax, the tremors intensified, the chamber shaking violently. The symbols on the ground flared with light, and for a moment, I thought the pit would reopen, that we would fail. But then, with a final, resounding crack, the tremors stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The oppressive energy was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost peaceful. The candles had gone out, their flames extinguished in the final moments of the ritual. But the pit remained sealed, the ground solid beneath our feet. "We did it," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer, but I felt a deep sense of relief wash over me. The entity was sealed, its power bound by the ancient ritual. For the first time since we had entered the tunnels, I felt like we were truly safe. We made our way back to the surface in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. The city above was still bustling with life, oblivious to the danger that had been lurking just beneath its streets. As we stepped into the cool night air, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure. The myth that had haunted the 2nd Avenue subway would remain just that, a myth, a story to be told in hushed whispers. But we knew the truth. We had faced the darkness, and we had won. And as we walked away from the tunnels for the last time, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. For now, though, the nightmare was over. And that was enough.
What did you think of this story? Was it everything you expected, or did it take you by surprise? If you enjoyed the chilling journey, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's dive into the second story and uncover even more of the unknown.
The apartment on 9th Street was the perfect place for a fresh start. After months of searching, I couldn't believe my luck when I found it. A charming one-bedroom in a quiet, old building, and at a price I could actually afford. It was the kind of place you'd expect to be snatched up in a heartbeat, yet somehow it had been sitting vacant for weeks. The landlord seemed almost too eager to rent it out, but I didn't think much of it. I was just grateful to finally have a space where I could focus on my writing. The move itself was uneventful, just a few boxes and some basic furniture. The apartment was furnished in that generic, somewhat dated style you find in older buildings: a faded floral couch, a rickety dining table, and a heavy wooden armchair in the corner of the living room. I decided to leave the armchair where it was. It had a certain character that I found oddly comforting. It was as if the chair had been there for decades, watching over the room and everyone who passed through. As I unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment was just a bit too quiet. The kind of silence that isn't just the absence of noise, but something deeper, almost oppressive. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that I was just getting used to a new place. After all, moving is stressful, and I'd been under a lot of pressure lately to finish my novel. I needed this apartment to be my sanctuary, my refuge from the world outside. That first night, I slept soundly, exhausted from the move. But when I woke the next morning, there was a chill in the air, even though it was the middle of summer. I shrugged it off as a quirk of the old building and went about my day, setting up my writing space and making the apartment feel like home. I hung some pictures, arranged my books on the shelves, and even picked up a few plants to brighten the place up. As the day turned into evening, I sat down at my desk, ready to finally get some work done. But as soon as I started typing, I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone walking slowly across the wooden floor. I froze, my fingers hovering above the keys, straining to listen. The sound was faint, almost like it was coming from another apartment, but it felt like it was right there, in the room with me. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing. Just the old armchair in the corner, facing away from me, as if it was deliberately turned to avoid my gaze. My heart was pounding, but I tried to calm myself down. It was an old building. Noises like that were probably normal. Maybe the neighbors upstairs were moving around, or the pipes were making weird sounds. I forced myself to get back to work, but the unease lingered, making it hard to concentrate. That night, the shuffling footsteps returned. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening as they moved through the apartment, soft, deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth. It didn't stop, even when I turned on the light. The sound was coming from the living room, just beyond my bedroom door, and it took everything I had not to go out there and check. Instead, I pulled the covers up to my chin and squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to fall asleep. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadows, all gathering in the corner of the living room, around that damn chair. I woke up sweating, my heart racing, the cold morning air doing nothing to cool me down. I couldn't stay in bed any longer, so I got up, made myself a cup of coffee, and went to the living room. The chair was still there, just as I'd left it. But something was different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it felt like the chair had shifted slightly, as if it had moved on its own during the night. I shook my head, laughing at my own paranoia. Chairs don't move on their own. I must have nudged it when I was walking around, or maybe I was just imagining things. But as I sat down with my coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that the chair was watching me. Even though it was turned away, I felt its presence, heavy and unnerving. I forced myself to ignore it, focusing on my writing instead. I needed to get some work done, to prove to myself that this apartment was just what I needed, a quiet place to finish my novel. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. And as the days passed, that feeling only grew stronger. The days turned into a blur of writing, with the strange occurrences in the apartment becoming more frequent. The shuffling footsteps at night continued, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always there, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. I started to hear other sounds too, whispers, barely audible, like a conversation just out of earshot. Every time I tried to listen closely, they would stop, leaving me in a silence that felt even more oppressive. During the day, I threw myself into my work, trying to drown out the unease with words. But the inspiration that had driven me to rent the apartment in the first place was slipping away, replaced by a growing obsession with the strange happenings. I found myself staring at the chair more and more, wondering about its history. Who had sat in it before me? Why was it left behind when the rest of the apartment was furnished with such care? One evening, after another restless night, I decided to ask the landlord about the previous tenants. I'd noticed that the neighbors were friendly enough, but they seemed to avoid the topic of my apartment. It was as if the apartment was a taboo subject, something they didn't want to discuss. The landlord, a gruff old man with a permanent scowl, was no different. When I asked him who had lived in the apartment before me, he hesitated, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decide how much to tell me. Finally, he sighed and said, "There was a man, years ago. An artist, I think. Lived there for decades, but one day he just disappeared. No one knows what happened to him. Place has been hard to rent ever since." I pressed him for more details, but he clammed up, muttering something about old buildings and their quirks before quickly changing the subject. I left the conversation feeling more unsettled than before. The idea of a tenant simply disappearing was chilling, and it made the strange occurrences in the apartment all the more sinister. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, and the footsteps seemed to be pacing right outside my bedroom door. Every creak of the floorboards set my nerves on edge, and I found myself staring at the door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadows again. This time, I saw the artist, his face hidden in darkness, standing in the corner of the living room, by the chair. In the dream, he didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching me. And when I woke up, the room was freezing, the cold seeping into my bones. The chair in the corner was still facing away from me, but now I was sure it had moved. The angle was slightly different, as if it had shifted during the night. I got up, shivering, and walked over to it, my breath coming out in white puffs. As I stood in front of the chair, I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to sit in it. I don't know what possessed me, but I lowered myself into the heavy wooden seat, feeling the cold would press against my back. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was silent, the whispers gone, and I started to think that maybe I had imagined everything. But then, I felt it, a presence, like someone was standing right behind me. I could feel their breath on the back of my neck, cold and damp, sending a shiver down my spine. I tried to turn around, but I couldn't move. It was as if the chair was holding me in place, keeping me from escaping. Panic surged through me, and I struggled to get up, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I managed to break free, stumbling out of the chair and backing away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The presence was gone, but the cold remained, lingering in the air like a ghostly reminder of what had just happened. I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer without understanding what was going on. I needed to know more about the artist, about the apartment's history, and about the permanent tenant that everyone seemed to whisper about. The next morning, I headed to the local library, determined to uncover the truth. I spent hours poring over old newspapers and records, searching for any mention of the artist or the building on 9th Street. At first, I found nothing, just mundane reports about the neighborhood, articles on the changing architecture of the city, and obituaries for people I didn't know. But then, I found it, an old article from the 1950s, buried in the archives. The headline read, "Local Artist Vanishes Without a Trace." The article described how the artist, a man named Arthur Green, had lived in the apartment for nearly 20 years. He was known for his reclusive nature, rarely leaving the apartment and even more rarely speaking to his neighbors. One day, he simply disappeared, leaving behind a nearly completed painting on his easel and a room filled with his works. The article mentioned that some of his paintings had been disturbing, filled with dark, shadowy figures and scenes that seemed to come from nightmares. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises from his apartment at night, footsteps, whispers, even cries for help. But no one had thought much of it at the time. They assumed it was just the eccentricities of a lonely artist. As I read, a chill ran down my spine. The description of the noises matched exactly what I had been hearing in the apartment. And the mention of shadows in his paintings made me think of the dreams I'd been having, of the shadowy figure standing in the corner of the living room. I knew then that Arthur Green hadn't really disappeared. He was still there, in the apartment, his presence lingering like a dark stain on the walls. The permanent tenant wasn't just a ghost story, it was real. And I was living in his apartment. The realization that Arthur Green was still in the apartment, in some ghostly, malevolent form, shook me to my core. I couldn't help but feel that every creak, every whisper, and every cold draft was his doing, his way of reminding me that I was trespassing in what was still his home. As much as I wanted to pack up and leave, something kept me tethered there, a morbid curiosity or perhaps the stubbornness of a writer desperate for inspiration. I spent the next few days diving deeper into Green's life and his artwork. The more I learned, the more I felt like I was unraveling a mystery that no one else had dared to touch. His paintings, which I found scattered in online archives and old art catalogs, were unsettling. They depicted shadowy figures standing in the corners of rooms, much like the one I'd seen in my dreams. In each painting, the figures were always half-formed, like they were emerging from the darkness or dissolving into it. One painting, in particular, caught my attention. It was titled The Watcher, and it showed a man sitting in a chair, his back turned, facing a shadowy corner. The image was hauntingly familiar, almost identical to the scene I'd witnessed in my own living room. The figure in the painting was indistinct, more a silhouette than a person, but there was something unmistakably eerie about it. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt like I was being pulled into the painting, as if the figure was trying to communicate with me. That night, I set up my camera in the living room, determined to capture whatever was happening. I placed it directly in front of the chair, the same spot where Green's watcher had sat. As I hit record, I felt a chill pass through the room, colder than any I'd felt before. It was as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. I sat down on the couch, keeping the chair in my line of sight. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I started to think that maybe it was all in my head, that I was letting the stories and my own imagination get the better of me. But then, just as I was about to give up, I saw it, a shadowy figure slowly forming in the chair. My breath caught in my throat as the figure solidified, becoming more distinct. It was a man, sitting exactly as Green had depicted in his painting, his back turned to me. I could see the outline of his shoulders, the curve of his neck, but his face was still hidden. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the camera, trying to zoom in on the figure. Suddenly, the figure moved. It wasn't much, just a slight shift, but it was enough to send a wave of terror through me. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away from the screen. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if he was about to turn and face me. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, knocking over a lamp in my haste. The figure in the chair seemed to react, his form flickering like a glitch on a video screen. Without thinking, I ran to the chair, my fear overridden by a desperate need to confront whatever was haunting the apartment. But as I reached out to touch the back of the chair, the figure vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. I stood there, panting, my hand trembling as it hovered over the empty space where the figure had been. I knew then that this was more than just a ghost haunting an old apartment. Arthur Green was trapped, his spirit bound to the very place where he had created his dark, twisted art. And somehow, I had become part of his world, drawn into the shadows that he had painted and brought to life. The whispers returned that night, louder and more insistent than ever. They seemed to be coming from all around me, echoing off the walls, seeping into my mind. They were no longer just background noise. They were voices, speaking in hushed, frantic tones. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I knew they were talking about me, warning me. I tried to block them out, but they only grew louder, more aggressive. The cold in the apartment became unbearable, a freezing chill that cut through my clothes and seeped into my bones. It was as if the very air was turning against me, trying to drive me out. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to figure out how to break whatever curse was binding Green to this place. I had to free him, and in doing so, free myself. The next morning, I returned to the library, desperate for answers. I pored over every record I could find, looking for anything that might explain Green's disappearance or the dark power that seemed to emanate from his paintings. Finally, I stumbled upon an old journal entry from one of Green's contemporaries, another artist who had lived in the same building. The entry was brief, but it mentioned something that sent a shiver down my spine. Green had been obsessed with the idea of capturing souls in his art. He believed that by painting a person, he could trap their spirit in the canvas, binding them to his work forever. The other artist had dismissed it as madness, but after Green's disappearance, he had started to wonder if there was some truth to it. I knew then what I had to do. Green's spirit wasn't just haunting the apartment, it was tied to his paintings, particularly The Watcher. If I could destroy the painting, I might be able to break the curse and free him. But it wouldn't be easy. I had no idea where the original painting was, or if it even still existed. I would have to start by destroying the replica I had found online, the one that had brought me into this nightmare in the first place. With renewed determination, I set out to find the tools I needed. The whispers followed me every step of the way, growing louder as if they knew what I was planning. But I didn't let them deter me. I had come too far to turn back now. The weight of what I was about to do pressed heavily on my chest as I prepared to destroy the replica of the Watcher. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was my only chance to break free from the terrifying grip of Arthur Green's lingering presence. The whispers, now constant and maddening, seemed to mock my efforts, growing in intensity as I approached the painting. I had gathered every tool I could think of, a hammer, a chisel, even a lighter, but none of them seemed adequate against the malevolent force I could feel radiating from the image on my screen. The figure in the painting, still facing away, seemed to be waiting for me, as if daring me to try. As I stood there, hammer in hand, I realized how foolish this all seemed. I was about to attack a digital image, something that shouldn't hold any power over me. Yet, deep down, I knew this was no ordinary picture. It was the key to everything that had happened in the apartment, the source of the cold dread that had seeped into my life since I had moved in. With a deep breath, I swung the hammer down onto the screen. The glass shattered, cracks spiderwebbing across the image, but the figure in the painting remained unchanged, unmoved by the destruction. I stared in disbelief as the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices swirling around me, each one laced with fear and desperation. Suddenly, a gust of icy wind blew through the apartment, extinguishing the lights and plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for the lighter, my hands shaking as I tried to ignite it. A small flame flickered to life, casting eerie shadows across the walls. That's when I saw it, green shadowy form emerging from the corner, more solid and menacing than ever before. He was no longer just a figure in a painting. He was here, in my apartment, his presence overwhelming the room with an oppressive weight. I could feel his cold eyes on me, even though his face was still turned away. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, drowning out my thoughts, as if they were trying to tear my mind apart. In a panic, I grabbed the broken pieces of the screen and threw them at the figure, desperate to banish it. But Green didn't flinch. Instead, he began to turn, slowly revealing his face. I knew I couldn't let him complete the motion. I had to act now, or it would be too late. Recalling the journal entry about Green's belief in capturing souls, I realized that the only way to truly end this was to confront him directly. I needed to face the terror head-on, to break whatever bond was holding him to this place. With nothing left to lose, I stepped toward him, holding the lighter up as if it could protect me. "Arthur Green!" I shouted, my voice trembling but resolute. "This is not your home anymore. You have to let go." For a moment, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the cold receded, and Green's shadowy form seemed to waver. I could feel the tension in the air, as if the very fabric of reality was stretching, ready to snap. But just as quickly as it had stopped, the pressure returned tenfold. Green's form solidified, and with a final, horrific twist, he fully faced me. His face was a twisted, tortured mask of rage and despair, eyes hollow yet burning with a terrifying intensity. The sight of it froze me in place, my courage evaporating in an instant. The whispers resumed, this time not in my ears, but in my mind, gnawing at my sanity. I felt like I was being pulled into his world, into the darkness that had consumed him. But then, just as I was about to succumb, something broke through the noise, a memory, fleeting but powerful, of the life I had before all this madness. It was enough. I gathered every ounce of strength I had left and lunged at Green's figure, forcing the lighter's flame toward him. The fire met his form, and for a brief second, I felt resistance, as if I was pushing against something solid. Then, with a flash of blinding light, Green's form exploded into a cloud of ash and smoke, dissipating into the air. The whispers ceased immediately, replaced by an eerie silence. The cold that had pervaded the apartment lifted, leaving behind only the normal chill of a New York night. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. It was over. Green was gone. I looked around the apartment, half expecting something else to jump out at me, but everything was still. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and for the first time since moving in, the apartment felt like just that, an apartment, no longer a prison. Exhausted but relieved, I gathered the broken pieces of my screen and threw them into a trash bag. There was no trace of Green left, no sign of the nightmare that had consumed my life for the past few weeks. As I prepared to leave the apartment for good, I glanced back at the chair one last time. It was empty, nothing more than a piece of furniture now. I stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind me with a sense of finality. The building was silent, the usual creaks and groans absent, as if it too was finally at peace. I walked down the stairs, feeling lighter with each step, until I reached the street. The cool night air greeted me, washing away the last remnants of fear. As I walked away from 9th Street, I knew I would never return to that apartment, never look back. Green's story was over, and so was mine. I had survived the tenant of 9th Street, and now it was time to move on.
If you want to watch another story, there is another video appearing on your screen now. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spine-chilling stories.